Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Monique Elikasi. I am the director for first year writing program here at Howard University in our Department of English. We're also very happy to have with us today our very own department chair. I see Dr. Carol Boyce Davis. Thank you so much for joining us today. And our director for writing across the curriculum, Dr. Marina Del Sol. And of course, our keynote speaker today, Dr. Wesley Rothman, along with a much of our students and our esteemed colleagues in the global community as well. So welcome each and every one of you. I would like to bring to you today Dr. Wesley Rothman, who will be presenting on From Peer Review to Collaborative Revision, Revising How We Empower Revision Within and Beyond the Classroom, Friday, October 4th, 2024 at 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Dr. Rothman is one of our very own faculty members here in our English department, and he is the author of SUBWOOFER, New Issues, Poetry and Prose 2017. And he is also working currently on a highly anticipated forthcoming publication, Wanted. Recent poems of his appear in the Hopkins Review, the Southern Humanities Review, the Slowdown podcast, hosted by Major Jackson, and the Montreal International Poetry Prize anthology. His book reviews and criticism have appeared in Publishers Weekly, the Rumpus, Rain Taxi Review of Books, the Boston Review, and Callaloo. He has taught composition here at Howard University and beyond, creative writing and literature for the past 12 years. And he holds advanced degrees from Emerson College and Catholic University. His scholarly research involves poetic craft and social responsibility in the work of Gwendolyn Brooks, Robert Penn Warren, and an array of contemporary poets. Without further ado, I welcome you, and please give a round of applause to Dr. Rothman.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Akasi. Yeah, so I mean, my interests and I guess studies have really focused on literature and creative writing, but as I think people know here at Howard, I teach mostly first year writing, composition, persuasive writing, rhetoric, things of that sort, and have been doing that for the majority of those 12 years. And so the reason I want to sort of clarify that getting into this is because I do think there is a lot to glean from not just literary studies, but especially creative writing when we talk about revision in the composition classroom, in the scholarly context that we work with our students, in the creative writing context that we work with our students, and that all applies and extends to life in so many capacities: professional, personal, ideological, critical, creative. So that's really where this comes out of, especially as my work in the composition classroom, the research writing classroom has evolved over the years. I realized that there's not a whole lot of scholarship and critical study about revision and how to teach revision. I've come across, a greatest hits assortment of people over the last 50 years. And I found one fairly recent article that I'll mention towards the end of my presentation that does a really wonderful job of synthesizing that history. But even in that recent sort of recollection and synthesis of how peer review, as it's often called, has been done and taught in the composition classroom, I still haven't really heard anybody talk about it the way that I'm trying to think and talk and teach about it. And so that's where this phrase collaborative revision comes into play. I found a few articles of people who are compositionists or composition faculty in various places talking about collaborative revision, but they were talking about it more in terms of collaborating with their colleagues on collaboratively revising, an article or a project that they were working on, less in terms of how we talk and teach this work. So if I may, I would like to share my screen and just kind of work through this presentation. Let's share this. Slides and play. All right. It's coming through, yes? Can see it well? Okay. So again, it's from working from this existing ongoing structure of thinking and speaking about the work we do with students regarding revision as peer review to something a little bit more pervasive, something a little more recursive that I think fits with a lot of other ways that we write and think and speak about writing and composition. So I'd like to just start by defining some terms. Much of my language here and the way that I speak to students in the classroom relies on some of the key pillars and elements of rhetoric. Having come out of Emerson, which was a very socially and communally progressive environment, and then teaching for several years and then working at Catholic University, which was much more traditionally Aristotelian, hardcore rhetoric, old school rhetoric studies. I've sort of melded the two, and I think it works well, but much of my language relies on this language of referring to invention as a part of our process of inventing our content, our ideas, what gets included, what gets excluded in the process of writing. Arrangement, is what it is. Organizing how we strategically pull together this information and present it in a particular order or sequence, and style, which has not only to do with language, but logical representation in language. I would argue it also involves syntax, how we strategically mess around with paragraphs or sentences or fragments or things of that sort. And then the standard sort of thinking about audience and purpose. So those are 5 huge staples that help, I think, us talk not just about this thing that is peer reviewed that kind of often leaves a bad taste in students' mouth, but is something that's more fundamental and collaborative and communal. And I also use a good deal of language intended to revise existing terminology and ideas in the classroom. So one thing that I hear often, and students are heavily in this mindset, and a lot of faculty are too, because it is so almost mundane in a way, the language that we use. It's so common, it's so familiar. So when we talk about a paper, I argue that that's actually a problematic term because it's so confusing on the level of genre. What is a paper? A paper is literally anything we write in any sort of academic setting, but also outside of academic settings. We use the word paper to refer to a lecture or a presentation. And so I find that word not especially helpful for students because, one, of how it teaches us to think about genre, but also because students say paper and get all sad and tired and exhausted by the idea. So I try, and I'll talk about this again shortly, I try to start transitioning and revising language so that it's something that's fresh for students and they're thinking about the real stakes of what they're doing. So moving from a word like paper to project, because I think what we do in the writing classroom isn't just pop out a piece of writing that looks all nice and shiny and is cool and smart. But it involves a lot of moving parts, and it involves a lot of work, emotional work, intellectual work, theoretical and strategic work as writers. So So I also try to start introducing other major like fundamental terms early in the semester, so that this is a part of our like revisionary way of thinking through the process of writing. So we move from instead of talking about an introductory paragraph, which is what students are often sort of conditioned into thinking about, we talk about it as there are introductory components, but we talk about it as a beginning. What is a beginning? How does the beginning function? Which in some ways, is a little more broad perhaps than an introduction, but it also is a little more flexible. It helps students think about how do you begin a presentation versus how do you begin an essay, or how do you begin a scientific article like that you're trying to collect data from, and present and engage an audience. And on the flip side, how do we shift from talking about something as a conclusion, which is a very scientific term, and is helpful in many ways, but it also is very final. And it's as if this thing will not be revisited, or that the conversation will not continue. And we all know that's not true. It will continue for us individually and for audiences. So shifting to this idea of an ending, how do I end this particular object that I'm fashioning in a way that keeps it open, or that invites and encourages a continued dialogue. And finally, this big and all important perhaps shift from talking about peer review, which again is something students hear and say with pain, to something that is a little more real, perhaps enjoyable, and something that reflects what we're trying to accomplish. So this presentation, or this like PowerPoint, is a bit wordier than I would like it to be, but I wanted to try and consolidate it so that I can share it with everybody, and the message is there. So as I'm sure we're all aware, a majority of students arrive in our classrooms largely conditioned to think about writing in terms of the 5-paragraph template. Sometimes it's a 3-paragraph template to sort of fit that AP exam or IB exam structure, as a function of their English literature coursework or language arts coursework, and as intended for the purposes and preferences of the teacher. Throughout especially the beginning of the semester. So this is perfect timing for this presentation, because we're just coming off of the first month and a half, right, of the semester. Throughout that time, we've been talking about like, how is it that you've learned about writing, and how can we revive that? How can we expand that? How can we use and reevaluate like how it is you're thinking about writing right now, and what do we need to do to expand, to add to that, to make it a little more nuanced and a little more reflective of what you're actually going to be doing, right, throughout your college career, but in life as thinkers and writers. So, much of teaching of writing before college doesn't really address how students might adapt the 5-paragraph structure. I distinctly remember being told few years ago in high school that this is how you're going to write in college. And then I got to college, and my first sort of writing heavy class, my first semester, was wild. The professor was like, you're going to write 2 pages double spaced every week. No paragraphs, no argument, nothing like that. You're just going to write 2 solid spaced pages, finish, whatever's at the end of the second page. That's it. You just kind of end in the middle of a sentence if you need to. And you're going to write about how the writer writes. And that's what we did all semester. And it was the most liberating, for some people, most chaotic thing to just think and practice getting that thought into writing in a way that we're really, unfortunately, often discouraged from doing in high school for probably some good reasons. But furthermore, as I think I started to hint at already, for many decades, revision has been largely limited to a step in the process of writing. And I think there have been some people who have been talking about it and writing about it in recent years, and especially the last decade or so, as something more than that. But revision is often limited to the sort of editing, like the post-production type part of writing, and enhancing a piece of writing within that 5-paragraph template. And it often, the way that students come to us thinking about revision, thinking about peer review is often very frustrated and frustrating, especially because, again, for some good reasons, sort of, a lot of revision that students encounter in high school is surface level, right? It has a lot to do with grammar, punctuation, this debatable argument of like correctness, because that's something that a teacher can sort of tell you did you correctly or incorrectly. And fortunately, I'm hearing from students more and more that they do deal with ideas. They do like work on revising ideas more and content and arguments and things of that nature. But even that is it's very soft approach that they're taking. And so that is very much, I think, and has been for a long time, our responsibility to help students get further into. So I would argue that revision isn't merely a stage or a step or a phase of a larger writing process. I would argue that it is much more pervasive and it's recursive. I remember when I was sort of like learning to teach and getting my sea legs in the classroom at Emerson College, talking a lot about how the writing process it is recursive. How we talk about it, therefore, is recursive. Whether we're talking about it from an audience purpose perspective and trying to help people think about who am I trying to reach, what does that mean, what do they need, what's going to confuse them, and what am I trying to accomplish as the writer or as the presenter. And for all of us, whether we've done more scientific research, scholarly research, creative writing, I'm sure we can all agree that like the writing process is recursive. It's rarely like we do all the research, we create a map, and we just crank it out. I'm sure some of us do that because people are talented and skilled and have lots of practice doing that. But we always write and then kind of come back and make changes or move things around or add to our argument or decide something's not fitting well or not doing what we need it to. So why not talk about that with students and frame revision in that way? And I think it's been well established and agreed upon for quite some time, at least the last 30 years, if not longer, that revision is more than editing, than proofreading, which is what a lot of students are sort of exposed to. This is my other sort of more theoretical argument, is that I think revision really is more arguably the foundation of education. Like through education of all kinds, not just school education, but like life education, we revise ourselves. Sometimes unconsciously, sometimes it's done for us or to us, but we're always evolving and changing and figuring out what works better or what is more ethical or what is more necessary in our lives. So to take our existing knowledge and theses and incorporate new knowledge and experiences and antitheses and perpetually undergo this synthetic revision, a writing over or complexifying of our former selves, right? What we thought, what we believed, what we assumed, what we understood, and what we don't know, and who we are. So that's the sort of higher pie in the sky theory behind all this. But yeah, I think with revision and peer review, the predominant models of revision pedagogy have students, write a full draft, then undergo independent revision or writing, proofreading, probably some kind of peer review where students, again, are asked to sort of focus on sort of mechanical, surface level elements of the writing. Not that those are unimportant, of course. And then maybe take that feedback, make some adjustments, and they're done. And I think this is somewhat rigid and gives students, I would argue, too loose or simple a sense of revision. Revision appears as a box to check. I even, just as recent as like 2 years ago, I think I had like a document that I called revision checklist. And I recently was like thinking about this presentation, and I've been trying to figure out how to organize all this for like perhaps some kind of article or conference presentation. And even that document that I called revision checklist, I was like, I don't like that anymore. I think that makes it a box to check rather than something that we're kind of consistently doing or are capable of doing. And so I think this revision still relies on professor instructions rather than revision that is driven by the writer's purpose and rhetorical like self-awareness. Um, one thing that I think comes out in the methods and ideas that I'll present next is that students are often uh, they have intuition. They're able to look at each other's work and their own work and realize with a little bit of time and a little bit of patience that uh, something's not working. They may not be able to describe it exactly in the sort of technical terminology that we have in rhetoric and composition, but they're able to identify it and sort of and speak to each other and maybe make some adjustments on their own. And so rather than it becoming this like, oh, I'm just doing what my professor says, I really try to create opportunities for students to feel what revision feels like when it's driven by their own ideas and their own passions and their own purpose in whatever they happen to be writing. Um, so this is where it's I kind of wanted to make it a little interactive and of a workshop sort, because I think we all have language, we all have tools, we all have exercises that we have that are like our go-tos for peer review or helping students revise. And so I was gonna ask, and maybe I'll just give it like a minute or two to see if people are interested in engaging. What are some sort of existing tools or exercises that you go to for revision, for peer review? I'm just curious if anybody wants to like explain or jump in or share, or even language. Yeah, Dr. Del Sol.
There I go. One thing that in the fall, I teach English 104, and our title is Writing Literacy and Discourse. And so I really this semester have really been thinking about like, what does discourse mean in terms of conversations in the public discourse and academic discourse. The biggest tool, my favorite tool, has to do with the oral. And I like to ask students to create a recording of themselves reading what they wrote before their classmates give them feedback. And that's because, like you mentioned, I actually have a great resistance towards having students correct one another's language, because language is about power, right? And like, what do we say is the correct words? I feel like a strong resistance to people telling each other how to speak. And I love having the students make a recording for them to hear their own voice. And I love them to respond to the recordings of the spoken, rather than they can't then go in and default to like, I'm going to correct what I think is like a comma error or a word I don't like or such. So that's my favorite tool.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, a couple things that you sort of remind me of in my own classroom is like when we work on language, and I part of what I'll talk about shortly is like how when we do collaborative revision work, it kind of borrows from the creative writing workshop in a way, not in the sort of the stodgy Iowa structure, which is like, oh, everybody's gonna like read the poem and talk about it, and the poet or the writer will be in the room but can't interact. But more in terms of like, if you were actually a collaborative author on this other person's project, how might you change the language? But like, why? I asked them to explain why. And I explicitly say, like, I say, we're not here to correct language. We're not here to make something correct or incorrect. That's not really a useful spectrum or binary for us to use. But stylistically, like, if we're using our voice, if we're trying to embody our voice in the writing, which is hard, which is a skill, it takes practice. How is it working? How might you change it if you were writing it? And at the end of the day, I tell everybody, like, you get to choose like whether to enact or apply this feedback that other people are giving you or not. It's your project. But then this gets multiple voices sort of in the space of the writing. And I'm probably going to borrow from you the recording idea, because I think hearing each other is so crucial, and hearing oneself is amazing. Um, That's awesome. Would anybody else care to share like tools or exercises or ways that they talk about peer review, revision?
Yes, I and thank you so much. I just want to piggyback off of Dr. Dosso. There is definitely, and I wanted to piggyback off of the recording. I usually would have them get into the peer editing content conferences, and the writer will read the paper out loud. The first time reading out loud, and the listeners are checking for the content. And then the second time, they're actually swapping drafts and looking at the drafts for syntax structure and so forth. But every time I notice when the writer reads out loud, they immediately take out some type of device and say, "Oh, that's not what I meant," because it's like an inner editor is within us when we're reading out loud. It's different actually hearing one reading it versus just taking the reading out loud versus just reading to ourselves and looking at it. And it's quite fascinating. And the language part, I think, is vitally important too in the politics of languages, and making sure that students question, well, what is the rhetorical situation and what is the stance? Because the rhetorical situation and the stance will have a lot to do with the language and finding a way to write in a way where one isn't losing their voice in the process, and making sure that they're writing authentically and not just writing for the professor, but writing for a real live audience.
Yeah, which is one of the toughest uh, conditions of the classroom, because we are inherently in an artificial situation. Like we're asking them to write as if they're writing to the world, but they don't, unfortunately. And sometimes there are ways to do this, I guess, but it's hard to make it so that this becomes real stakes, so that it's something that gets published and is going to be read by people. Like how do you begin to imagine that when you're just in a classroom and the only person at the end of the day who has any sort of power involved in your writing is the professor. So much of our work, whether it's with revision or in general, is about on some level, I think, decentering ourselves and trying to figure out how do you get, or decentering the professor, right? And how do you get these writers to inhabit a position that is imaginative for a lot of, in a lot of ways. Yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, Sarah.
So I don't have anything nearly as creative as some of you do to I think of my peer review as fairly fairly standard, but I have noticed that I have changed it over time, because I noticed that students do gravitate toward grammar and punctuation, and just to the exclusion of almost everything else, right?
Yeah.
They don't want, they feel, I think they feel more comfortable saying, oh, you forgot a comma here, or you forgot this or that, but they feel a lot less comfortable engaging with the ideas of someone else, because if you're critiquing the ideas, I guess it seems like you're asking them to do a lot more work. And so I do have them. I have a big list of sort of questions that I ask them to answer, and almost all of the questions are about bigger aspects of the writing, whether it, a lot of them are about different argument parts, about the strength of the evidence, about relationship between the thesis and the reasons. I asked a lot of questions about structure and things like that, and and then I have a sort of catch-all at the very end for what are your 2 or 3 main suggestions, and yeah, it's at the end almost everybody says, oh, you forgot a comma in this place, or you you did this or that. But I feel like having a big list of very specific questions that I want them to answer just keeps them focused on the bigger picture. But so yeah, I mean, I feel like my peer review is something that I want to work on, maybe making more creative. But I do know that that keeping them focused on the the structure, the content, the argument, those sorts of things is something that I sort of struggle to do, but I have made some progress on.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. I mean, it is tough. They students by and large have a sort of magnetism or a magnetic draw toward that because, and I think many times what we end up talking about in the classroom is that students feel more knowledgeable and more credible when it comes to like grammar and punctuation because it was drilled into them for so long. And they often tell me that they don't feel like they have the authority get involved in other people's ideas, in their examples or their arguments or explanations, and I understand that. What we end up talking about, or where we end up taking that conversation, is usually like, why not? It's what we're doing in writing is very akin to what you do with your friends when you're talking about anything. Like you jump into the conversation, you ask questions, you offer criticism to your friends. Like so how do we treat the writing in many ways as Dr. De La Soul said, right, as discourse? Like it feels more formal and special and schooly because we've been embedded in this school writing for so long. But what we're practicing and trying to enhance is partly for the rest of their like college career or academic career. But after college, none of them are going to write, 90 to 95% of them are never going to write an academic essay ever again. So we're also preparing them to just have discourse and have disagreements and have arguments and poke and prod and ask questions and try to help each other. And that's, again, it brings me back to my phrase of like, and my dependence or reliance on this phrase of collaborative revision, that it's what we're really doing is community. Like we're trying to get into this community headspace as thinkers, as people, and ultimately as writers. Dr. Del Sol, did you want to add something?
I guess I just want to say I really appreciate being in this space and this conversation right now. I just finished teaching a class and we were doing peer review. One thing I think about when we're talking about peer review with the revision of ideas, about how that requires vulnerability, and we're expecting vulnerability of students, and thinking about what does that mean at this particular history, like where are we in this historical moment, and what does it mean to be willing to be vulnerable, right? One of the students had said, I asked the students to share, and someone said they had a dissenting opinion and they were fearful to share. And it really struck me of, I can say this is a safe space to share, but is it? Where do we go from here? And I'm thinking a lot about this idea of what does it mean to be vulnerable, and what does it mean for this? At some point, I found myself older, and I don't know when this happened, where I crossed some kind of line and I grew up in a different historical moment where dissent was something that was more acceptable. So I wonder, what does it feel like for the student that is our typical first year writing student at this historical moment to be expected to be vulnerable, and what experiences and training have they had that have rewarded dissent, right, or rewarded having a dialogue, and then what experiences have they had that have punished dissent, or made them feel ostracized. So thank you everyone for giving me this space to think through, to explore these ideas.
That's terrific. I mean, really what you just described is also another immensely huge tool and helpful tool that I think, I'm sure everybody does it on some level, but like you're talking about reflection, like the discourse of reflection, and how do we as a group reflect about being able to disagree, to like get into the nitty gritty sort of wonderings about whatever we're writing about or thinking about or reading about. And I mean, in my own classroom, the foray or the entry into those things is often the readings, like the things that we do as a sort of warm up thinking about them rhetorically, but also the content, which, I mean, we're at Howard, so we get to do a whole lot of different cool things with the types of readings that we involve. Right? Like right now, I think we just read a piece from Audre Lorde, followed by Gloria Anzaldúa, followed by some poems and a brand new book by Danez Smith. And I mean, they're dealing with some things that students are swimming in the middle of because of the election, because of the time in which they've grown up. Yeah. So, Sarah, yeah.
Just another small thing. Another thing that I do is, when we're talking about the parts of an argument, how the different parts fit together and the structure of an argument, one of the things that I really emphasize is, like, one of the basic components of an argument is that you have to acknowledge and respond to potential objections, challenges, alternatives, alternative interpretations, etc. And I present that, as just like a basic component of argument, and as something that is just expected and required in every, I mean, and that to some extent that's a little bit, I guess, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I want them to, I require them to engage with at least one alternative point of view or one objection or challenge to some part of their argument. And a lot of them, and I say, if you can't think of any objections or challenges, that's not a good thing. That doesn't mean that your argument is bulletproof. It means that your argument is likely not very contestable. Which is not good, right? So I have them use the peer review to help them think of those potential objections and challenges, right? I sort of try to get them to think that it can be hard to read your own writing in a sort of skeptical way, and so getting the opportunity to get some feedback from your peers is a great way to help you if you're struggling to come up with some objection or challenge to your argument that you can engage with. So yeah, sort of making that a core component of sort of what I talk about when I talk about argument is something that I do. Because otherwise I feel like it wouldn't happen.
Sure, absolutely. No, I mean that also brings up, I think, two things that'll help sort of segue us forward. One is I like to talk to students about how this collaborative revision work is basically you're getting free readers, right? Like that's what it is. Like you're test running, test driving, or doing some kind of focus group on what your work is currently doing, how it's affecting an audience, how it's clear, unclear, holistic, or missing things. I also think this is a good time to highlight a lot of the courses that I teach, 101, 102, 103, are a little more on the foundational side. And so argumentation is obviously an important thing that is a part of life. It is a part of academic life and thought. It's scientific in many ways. But we're also, I at least try to approach our work as preparing them for that or enhancing their abilities in that realm, but also that writing isn't always argumentative, even though, who was it, Andrea Lunsford, who said everything's an argument, right? Like, which I see the use, I love that idea. But not everything is a hardcore argument, right? Where we're like debating and arguing a point and trying to prove something. A lot of academic work certainly lives in that space. But I think that's a good way to kind of move forward. So I think these are sort of three types of categories or three levels on which we might think about revising, how we revise, how we do revision in the classroom, how we teach revision or guide revision, right? So to reorient and enhance students' philosophy and experiential learning of revision, I think one is to explicitly talk about how we describe revision, how we talk about it, right? So things like shifting from paper to project or peer review to collaborative revision. How do students talk about revision? Do they talk about revision? And usually that involves a conversation about like, well, what do you think? Like, what do you do? What is revision, dear students? And a lot of them will be like, oh, proofreading, editing, things of that sort. Maybe a little bit of like honing an argument. But for the writing classroom, and especially if we're thinking holistically, how we organize things, how we structure things, what our hopes are as a writer for the experience of the reader, how we're even thinking about a reader, what our motivations are, right? The language that we use to talk about all those things is one huge level that is an opportunity, I think, to shift things, to be aware of, to reflect on for ourselves as teachers, and to test out and experiment in the classroom. The next level is like how we identify different actions, different variations of revision, right? So proofreading, editing, those are very essential things to do. They're part of revision, but what are the other sort of ways in which we can revise? And so a lot of the discussion that we end up having is like, I actually, and I kind of explain this a little later, like I at least for the first project in a semester, I ask students, I'm like, you can sit down and make an outline, but skip writing your introduction or your beginning. Like skip writing the first part, because, and I ask them this and we usually have a conversation about it. I'm always like, what's the hardest part about writing for you? And they're like, the beginning, usually. I'm like, why do you think that is? And we get to this point where there's a pretty major consensus that like, it's hard because you're introducing something that you haven't written yet, or even necessarily thought or figured out or dug into yet. And so, I don't know, everybody I'm sure has had their own experience with this. When I was doing my dissertation, my advisor was like, just start writing about the poets and the poems and stuff, and like you'll figure it out. You don't even know what your argument is. You've made a proposal, but you don't really know what your argument is until you get like knee deep in it for a while. And so that's what we do, and that sets us up to just talk about and focus on revising and clarifying and extending and adding examples or stories or evidence or ideas to something that becomes a draft, right? Something that becomes a whole piece. And then we can start talking about, all right, you've got this meat to your project, and then how does a beginning, or what does a beginning and an ending look like? How does that fit into your structural strategy and the experience you're curating for your audience? So this is just, I'm trying to give an example of like how we're talking about somewhat distinct revision actions that begin instantly, right? It begins with just starting to figure out what we're writing about, why we're writing about it, what our goals are for it, who our audience might be, and inventing content, not in the like social media way, but you know what I mean. Right. And so the last sort of level I think is really useful is how we sequence the students' experiences of revising. Because we have to do this like ultra meta work of imagining what their experience is going to be like going through these different ways of writing and thinking about revising and developing their piece. So how is it that we might sequence all of this to, I would argue, better integrate revision as something they're aware of and doing intentionally throughout the process? I think it was Peter Elbow, who's like really famous compositionist, who like wrote a book and was on this side of an argument of like writing is revision, writing as revision. And I actually, this is not meant to be like a humble brag or anything. Right after grad school at Emerson, I got to be on like a little group symposium workshop for a weekend with him at UMass Amherst. And I remember we were talking about this. He kind of rolled his eyes at the idea, even though it was something that he was like central to I think it was in like the early 90s, talking about this thing. But that has been a very useful approach, and it's one of the resources that I list on the like very end of the presentation. So as I've sort of said, I think throughout this time, like on the level of language, that it's helpful to talk about revision as ever-present process of transformation and evolution and refinement, both on the, well, not both, all of the levels of ideas and examples and reasons and explanation and analysis, that it's embedded in invention, right? That revision is development of your content, but it's also development of like, why are you doing this? What are you trying to get your audience to do with this? Are you trying to change their mind? Are you trying to make them aware of something they might not already be aware of? Are you trying to get them to vote a certain way? Are you trying to get them to spend their money, or just behave a certain way in the world? Which again it brings us back, I think, to the idea that we are in a very artificial environment. Students, we talk about purpose, and they're like, well, my purpose is to get an A. And I'm like, yeah, but like rhetorically in the world, like when you're talking to somebody and arguing with somebody or writing to somebody, what are you trying to do? And they're like, I don't know. So then we spend time talking and working through that. So to get back to this sort of transition or revision from peer review to collaborative revision, as I'm sure everybody's experienced, right? Peer review often comes with negative connotations. Students have told me hundreds of times that they feel like it's a waste of time. It doesn't help them, doesn't help their writing. They feel kind of stupid going through the process. That it often focuses on like mechanics, which again is not unimportant, something to be aware of, but should we in our classes be dedicating, as much space to that when we could be better equipping and helping and empowering students on intellectual, critical, creative, personal, human levels? It's a big question. It's often oversimplified, I think. One way I talk about peer review is just breaking down the phrase. And so one way is that like the word peer is actually a really awkward word for a lot of people, especially students. They're like, nobody ever uses that word in real life. And so it kind of, actually just like 2 weeks ago, we were talking about this and I was like, how does the word peer sound? Like, what does it make you think or feel when you hear that word? And they're like, sterile, robotic, disconnected, like we're just in a room with somebody. And I was like, and we ended up talking about how the only other context that we really hear that word a lot in the public is like in the context of law and the jury of our peers. That's pretty much it. So it's this weird word that we use, but people don't really use it that much. And so there's, not only are they coming with this kind of negative connotation and experience, the phrase sounds odd and awkward and distant. And also, I don't know how helpful review is as an idea, right? Students often think of like, quickly look over. That's like their definition of review. I also bring into the mix the idea that reviews are often judgmental, right? Like it's good or bad. It's a good movie, a bad movie, or it's B movie, right? Whatever. And so there's a lot of room, I think, for confusion. But if we pivot to this idea of like collaborative revision, it emphasizes the fact that we're working together, the fact that we're in community with one another, that we perhaps, and this is where they all sort of stutter a little because they want to be good people. But I'm like, we all care about each other, right? We want everybody in here to do well, right? And they're like, maybe, because it's easier to focus on our own academic performance. But if we're in this communal situation and trying to help each other and caring about each other, which we all have experience with, then it changes the stakes a little bit and it makes it more of a conversation. It makes it more human and real. And then if we're doing revision, then we're re-envisioning, we're changing, we're evolving something, we're enhancing, we're tweaking, we're experimenting. And I think that connotation is largely positive for students, at least when I've been experimenting with this. So on the level of revision actions, I don't think you need me really to run through this, but I think I want it here so that I would love to share this with the department, with the program, just so people can refer to it if it's helpful in any way. But it runs the sort of linear process of writing, right? We go from having nothing to eventually having a finished product. But the way that happens is much more complex than pre-writing, drafting, enhancing, revising, editing done. So I think revision is sort of woven through all of these elements that are ever present from even before the writing process actually begins. Right. So as we invent or select material for our writing, we're already engaged in revising because we're figuring things out. We're reading, we're researching, we're adding and changing what is available to us to incorporate in the project. And then as we start writing and translating our thoughts and organizing those things, right? Even as early as like outlining, right? If that's a thing that works for people, we're in the midst of making revisions. One really small but real way that I think most people revise is as you're writing, especially an essay or a project or something, you catch like what you just typed and you delete a few words and you change it. That's a very small incremental way that people revise all the time. And we don't often talk about that as revision. And so I like to enhance and emphasize that in the classroom. And so all the way through this process of collaboratively revising and then continuing to sort of revise independently, but in community, I think is this sort of this recursive loop that has so many benefits, which I hope to mention in a moment before we kind of round out the hour. This has a lot of words, but it's really I won't run through this one at all. It's really just more of like a possible sequence for talking about and setting up revision as something that is ever present, that is part of, as I just described, like the sort of idea and research and clarifying and learning process that spills over into how we start making notes or outlines, or even just starting to write paragraphs about an example or a story or evidence or a theory that we have, and how throughout that process we're ever revising, not only in what we're saying and how we're speaking it into writing, but how we're moving things around. The more we sort of get out onto a screen or a page, the more material we have to work with and reevaluate how we're structuring it. What sort of experience, why are we putting this first and this other bit of information towards the end that we could put at the very beginning? Like, so I think asking students to step back as they get further and further along in the writing process and think holistically about the structure, about the organization, how does that fit with what they're trying to get the audience to experience? And, you know, some examples come from the readings that we have, like this person, you know, Baldwin, for example, will like open a story with a bunch, or an essay with a bunch of statistics. And there's a reason for that, because then it becomes like a spider web that throughout the essay, he comes back to those statistics in his, you know, eloquent, analytical, part preach, part memoir way. But that's, I think, you know, looking back at what we've read, thinking about what they're writing and trying to understand it strategically in terms of organization, in terms of their style, language, personality, voice, syntax, all of those things, it really plunges them into thinking more as a writer, but also thinking critically about a lot of things, about the writing as like a sculpture, as a thing that they're building, but also the things behind it, the things that inhabit it, the real world, the urgent, it's one of my favorite words, urgent, right, issues that they're addressing or getting into in a given project. So the last thing I just want to emphasize before kind of finishing is that when we get to this sort of midpoint in a project together and really sit down to do collaborative revision where we're looking at each other's work, one of my great emphases is that like it's not just a matter of like switching projects and looking at everything, right? What I really emphasize and what I think is fundamental to this collaborative work is, and I think Sarah, you said something really useful to this earlier, is that it helps to like look at somebody else's writing and just isolate a part. Like look at the beginning, whether that's the first paragraph or the first page and a half, Just think about it as a beginning. How is this beginning working? What is it giving you as a reader? And what do you want, or what do you need from it? Do you need some more explanation? Do you need some term clarified? Do you need some more context? Do you need to understand something about the writer and why this is important to them? And so by isolating, whether it's a beginning, which, and this is all language that I've kind of mentioned at one point or another, isolating the beginning, or looking at somebody else's project and isolating the ending, or reading the whole thing and thinking about sort of the soundness or the reasonableness of their arguments and reasons, or even just we do this as well. Like, we'll do a round of collaborative revision in teams of 2 or 3 or 4, where they'll read somebody's project and they'll just focus on the voice. They'll just listen to that writer's voice and say, like, I'll ask them specific questions, like, are there any moments that sound kind of robotic or unusual to the voice that you hear elsewhere in their writing? Is there a sentence or 2 or 3 that you think are like really succeeding both in voice and in the idea, and that gives the writer a sense of what they're doing well and that they should do something more like that. So it leads to concrete feedback that is focused, and that usually has reasons. But it also then, this is my sort of big argument for all this, is that by doing this work where we go and look at isolated parts of other people's writing, it gets us out of ourselves and gets us more comfortable with reading a piece of writing as a piece of writing, not as this sort of like personal thing we can't argue with, but something that is like, how is this working and how might it work differently or more? How could you help enhance it? And then when students come back to their own writing, they're a little more of like a stranger or an outsider to their own writing, because they can think about it more as this piece of writing rather than this thing that they know what they mean, right? We know what we mean when we write. So it's hard to sort of separate ourselves from our writing and treat it dispassionately, treat it as an outsider. And I think the more we do this collaborative revision, it seems to me that the more students are able to come back to their work and revise independently and more effectively, to clarify their ideas, to strategically organize whatever they've organized, and to tinker and experiment and stretch the style or the form of what they're saying. So I included this just because it's one list. It's what I like to refer to as revision boot camp, but it lists a lot of like the kind of specific things and isolated parts of writing that we talk about, and that I try to help students or guide students to help each other with, and that they can use this, when they go and are working and finalizing and revising on their own. And then finally, these are just a couple of things that I referenced along the way, that are useful resources that talk about revision in ways that I think truly are helpful and have been pretty useful to me in thinking all this through. So thank you for your time and listening, and I hope this becomes something useful, or some of it becomes useful on some level for you.
Wow, let's give Dr. Rothman another round of applause. Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. And I thank all of you for joining us. What an excellent presentation. And we're definitely in conversation. This will be posted on our YouTube channel through the Department of English here at Howard University. And also we have, I've received an offer. So those of you who have been presenting through this professional development workshop, be on the lookout for an opportunity to form an anthology of our professional development workshop presentations into articles with Cambridge. So I'll be reaching out to each and every one of you who have taken the time to develop these excellent presentations and to think about the possibility of compiling these into an anthology, best practices from our very own Howard University's Department of English within first year writing. So I thank you all, each and every one of you. We will be having Dr. Asao Inoue as well. I will let you know the exact date and time for that. So be on the lookout for that for our next professional development workshop regarding rubrics. But thank you again. I hope you all have an excellent day. And Dr. Rothman, quickly, is there a way that our audience can keep in contact with you? Do you have an email address?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, wesley.rothman@howard.edu is, I check it 50 times a day. Yeah, that's great. And I'm happy to share this, the PowerPoint with anybody directly. And if there's a repository that we can put it in, like, let's do it.
All right. We definitely have the Canvas platform. So definitely, if you get a chance, just share it with me. I'll post it under this week's, because this is a wealth of information, as well as from last week's with Dr. Delsose, and I want to make sure that I embed it into our newsletter. I may have to push the newsletter back till Monday, because I definitely want this recording and Dr. Delsose recording embedded into the newsletter as well. But
Wonderful.
thank you. Awesome. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Until next time. Bye.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.